I want to go ahead and welcome Brandie Melendez, 98. She is a graduate from Brown with a degree in psychology, and she entered the human resources field seeking to combine this interest in psychology with the corporate environment. In '99, she began her career at Union Square Technology Group, which was a 30-person IT company, and several years later was acquired by MindShift Technologies. Thank you. Now, MindShift is a 660-person company. It's one of the largest IT outsourcing and cloud service providers serving small and mid-sized companies. Her experience includes establishing the human resources function within her growing organization and extensive acquisition experience. In her current role, she's responsible for the entire human resources function, including employee and leadership relation and development, culture transition, organizational development, succession, strategic workforce planning, recruiting, training, the whole gamut. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and her 2 young children, and she's going to share some of her insights from that human resources world with us today and talk about how that might be affecting those who been out less than 10 years and the world of work and entering it. So Brandie, welcome.
Thank you very much, Heather, for that introduction, and I'm excited to be here talking about some of the challenges associated with navigating the early stages of one's career. So some of the things we'll talk about today are millennial stereotypes, some of the challenges that new professionals have when they're interacting with more senior professionals and the different perspectives, some of the young alumni difficulties, interviewing tips, making the next step the right step if you're making some decisions about what to do next, and then once you've landed the job that you want or the role that you want, how to start that new relationship successfully. So what are the stereotypes that we are talking about today? In order to really to get into the discussion, we need to sort of address what they are. And Heather, I think this might be a good place to ask a question about what they are seeing as stereotypes that they're interacting or that they're noticing in their job searches, and we'll talk about some of the ones that we know are out there right now.
Okay, so I'll send that out to everyone and give us your opinion so that we can be sure we're addressing it.
Okay, thanks, Heather. So some of the stereotypes that we see in the workplace these days, some of the complaints really that we hear from more senior professionals about millennial professionals. They're comfortable with change. They're not satisfied. They feel a sense of entitlement. It's all about them and not their role or responsibilities to the organization they work for. The expectation that they are going to be praised for every small accomplishment that happens, and that there's little tolerance for entry-level tasks. Now, it's interesting because some of these things, specifically the level of being comfortable with change, can also have a flip side of positivity. Sometimes in certain organizations or environments, being really flexible is a very good thing. But mediating that between having that ability to be flexible and also not expecting there to be change all the time are some of the challenges that I definitely see with our more junior professionals in the organization. I'm, as Heather indicated, within the realm of IT world, and certainly that is an environment that has a lot of learning and change, and sometimes what we see is the expectations are really, really even exceed what we can do. One of the things that I think is really, really important for young professionals to realize is that there is a need for them to have realistic expectations about what will happen in the early courses of their career, and to be mindful of that relationship with their employer. So let's talk about Heather. Do we have any ideas that came in about the any responses of stereotypes that people are seeing that we didn't touch on there?
Yeah, there's, a couple of responses of, well, these can also be good things, optimistic things, and that is so true, and that's definitely how you and I talked about. That's, how you're going to handle these issues and talk about how that's great. A couple of things about, not being willing to work long hours, and then what you said about the unrealistic expectations. Another positive thing is, being culture blind.
Those are really good points, and as I was mentioning, there's a flip side to that. So it's really what we're going to talk about are the ways to focus on the upside, to focus on how those things are positive, if that really is the sentiment. And then some ways to, fight the stereotype. One of them is really about the willingness, to pay your dues. And so I have some suggestions about that. One thing is to sweat the small stuff. So the way that you respond to requests that you are less than enthusiastic about really does matter. We know, certainly employers know and more senior professionals know that in more junior level positions, we're asking you to do something that you might not be jumping up and down to want to do. But the way that you do that work and you're showing your excellence and your commitment and your organization skills and the fact that even those things are done well really goes a long way in terms of fighting a stereotype, and more importantly goes a long way in terms of showing your teams, your manager, your organization that you're willing to do what it takes to do a great job at all times. And that leads to the fact that all good things come in time. You use those opportunities to show your excellent work, show that you're looking to improve things, show that you're a team player. That will open up opportunities for earning the right, really, to get more harder, more complex tasks that might turn out to also be more interesting and more challenging for you. So you have to use, your ability to show you've done a good job to your advantage, and then sort of have those open up the opportunity to do more interesting things. The next real piece of information that I think is important to think about is what investment you're making in the role or in the organization, or really to your teams. So once you have decided to take on a role, there's some goal in there for you, and the organization also has a reason why they've asked you to do that role. So I always recommend young professionals to have enthusiasm about what you're doing. Even if it's not exactly where you want to be yet, be thoughtful about what it is you're doing a good job, what that importance is to the organization, and have goals. Either you're going to master a skill that you have, you've been offered the opportunity to show. Understand that it doesn't always happen right away, but if you're given the opportunities and you're in a role that is going to get you there, having some patience will help. I always say to be honest and earnest about why the role is important to your growth, and always remember to understand and demonstrate how that work is important to the organization. It's really important to your future within and outside of the current organization that you're able to do that. Understanding what the smaller piece that you're currently doing has in the bigger picture is important to your own satisfaction within that role as well. And then demonstrate balance, not entitlement. Enthusiasm and ambition and wanting to love your work and progress rapidly are really positive traits. Employers want employees like you, and not just because you're awesome, and we know you are awesome, but because the best scenario is that was when there is synergy in the relationship overall. So, prior experience, where you went to school, all the other, maybe your networking relationships will have the influence of opening doors for you. But your actions and your attitude influence how you're viewed beyond that. Your actual work is what matters once that door has been opened and once you have that opportunity. So let's talk a little bit about some job search challenges. While I go over this is another opportunity, I think, Heather, for us to talk about what challenges that some of the audience is facing as well.
Great. So I'll send out a note to the audience. Let us know if there's challenges that we're missing here.
Okay. So one of the things that we know is a challenge as you're searching for a new position is your potential lack of experience. If you haven't done it before, and there are others who have done it before and are, competing for the same roles, or it's something that you don't have experience with, but you want to learn, you want to get that initial experience, it may be hard to find that first opportunity. If you've had a lot of job changes and short tenure, that can be a challenge in your job search because it shows really a lack of proven commitment to an organization or a path. And there may be some really good reasons why these things have happened, which we'll talk about a little bit, but these are things that we know are challenges for young professionals especially. And really that's one that maybe applies across the board, quite honestly. You may have, for example, accepted, internships or other types of roles that were short tenured, or decided that a role that you accepted was not the right one and moved on in a short period of time. Too much of that can be a challenge in explaining to an interviewer or a recruiter, and it can be, something that weighs against you in comparison to someone else that has some more proven experience or some more tenure, shows some more commitment to an organization. So one thing that so I guess, Heather, do we have any challenges there that have come in that we should talk about before we move on?
We do have some really great challenges here that I think will fit right in with some of the things you're discussing, and maybe we hold off to giving a little bit of it, but things like what if you're one of 1,000 applications? Well, most of the jobs I see are all entry level. Presumption that a liberal arts education does not teach useful job-related skills. So those are things to talk about. So I think you'll set them up, and maybe those can be addressed as part of it, and anything that's not covered, I'll bring it back up.
Okay, let's then go to the next part and then we'll address those, I guess. So when you're going into an interview, and part of those challenges that you're mentioning are about, kind of how you go into this. How do you go into it if I'm one of 1,000, for example? And how do you stand out as one of 1,000 resumes? One huge thing is preparation. You have to go into an interview or even from that initial discussion with a recruiter or a response, knowing about what you're applying for. So the first step is researching the organization. You should do whatever you can to find out about, via their websites, their career pages. If you have any friends or acquaintances within your network that are familiar with the organization, find out all you can about an organization. Once you're applying to a specific role, make sure you research the role. I can't tell you how many times that someone has had an automated response to something, a job posting, and then have come in or had a conversation with one of the people on my recruiting team and not really known what they were responding to. It really obviously is not the way to start off. So know what the role is, know what the job requirements are, know what, get as much of a sense of the role as you can from a job description. And again, using whatever you can, networking or other opportunities to find out information. Many companies really do a great job within their websites or articles published, et cetera, of communicating what their values are. Find out as much information as you can about the values of the organization. So, that's for you, because it's important for those things to be aligned, but also so that you go in looking and sounding like you have a real interest and are knowledgeable about what you're interviewing for. And then the last piece, that in terms of being prepared are to come with questions. Know what your interests are. Set up, use the information about the organization, the role, and the values to come in prepared with some questions. I think it's okay to have notes, prepared with you for an interview. You should certainly know what you want to ask, but it's okay to have something to refer to. Remember, though, to use them as a reference point and not let it be sort of head down looking at your questions. That sort of sets you up to be in the right position for when you go into the interview itself. And then when you go into your interview, it's really about telling your story. And this, again, I have a recruiting team, and so, our recruiters often are the first line of discussion before someone would get to a hiring manager for many of our positions. The recruiters that you work with, especially when they're internal to an organization, can have a very big impact on the hiring managers, big influence on the hiring managers. So be ready to tell your story in a way that's attractive to potential employers. There's some ways to do that. And again, look at the interview as you are going in there to tell your story. Let them get to know you a little bit. Let them be able to envision you within their environment or in a role. That's really your goal, from the candidate perspective within an interview. We already talked about this a little bit, but ask related questions. I talked about the questions that you can prepare in advance, but also, as you're having the conversation, utilize the natural opportunities that come up to ask questions as you're going through the conversation. The interview should really be, in the best case scenario, it's a discussion versus a Q&A, I think. And use those questions that you've sort of prepared and you have in your mind during the natural course of that conversation, and certainly use any information that you're receiving in the interview to ask questions you hadn't thought of that are a natural part of the conversation, because that shows your ability to take information in and kind of translate it into something meaningful within a discussion, which is an important part of any role. Relate your experiences to your job. So this is to the question, of applying to entry-level jobs, or where you have a lack of experience, or you're one of many applicants, right? Your experiences, even in school, in internships, and other entry levels, can apply to a new role, and you have to be able to pick out how that is. So maybe the role, you've had project management because you worked on an expansive project, even in school or in an internship or something else, and you can see how that applies to the role you're applying for. Relate your personal experiences to the job. Show that you can extrapolate the information that you've learned or received and apply it to what's going to be in front of you in the future. The next thing that I think is always a part of telling your story is speaking to any missteps and what you learned from them. So back to our conversation regarding having a lot of, potentially having a lot of short tenure. If you made some bad decisions about the roles you've accepted, or you had to do them for some other reason, or it didn't work out for some reason, you should be, I always suggest that people are frank about that. Tell people what you learned, and how you are going to apply that knowledge to what happens in the future in this role or wherever you land. It shows that you have the ability to learn from what's happened in the past and apply it, and really be honest about kind of what's happening. Another thing to be mindful of is your strengths and your commitment to work hard. You can, in terms of combating the stereotypes, you really need to be able to articulate why the role that you're applying for is potentially the one for you in the future, and why you can be committed to it, what you plan to learn, your willingness to learn about an organization, your willingness to learn about a practice or a role, your willingness to move forward. Certainly, as I said before, it's a really important and it's a positive trait to want to make progress, but also balance that with your willingness and commitment to an organization. I think this is probably the biggest one in terms of stereotypes that are really prevalent in our more senior professional roles. But we really see often is that people really want to learn a skill or a thing, and once they've learned it, then they're looking to move on. Again, this is about the balance and the synergy. Employers know that. Employers know, and they're the ones that may be training you to go do something else. But that's not really efficient from a business perspective, right? There's got to be a balance. And we're going to teach you things. You're going to have an opportunity to learn and move forward either here or elsewhere. But there's something in return that you're providing to the employer, and you really should show a willingness to do that. And then the last thing in terms of telling your story that we want to talk about right now is to be yourself. If you go in pretending like something you're not, if you're trying to show them what you think they want to see, it's probably not going to work out in the best. It's because often in interviews there's something, we see candidates who who we think have the skills, but there's something that is not quite fitting or doesn't really make sense, and you end up bringing we end up bringing that person back to meet with them again because we're trying to figure out what that is. Being yourself right up front can save you some unnecessary rounds of interviewing. If yourself is not really a good fit for them, better to know that sooner rather than later. If you're able to convey a natural sense of yourself, and certainly the well-mannered professional side of yourself we want to see, it's much better to see if it's going to be a good culture fit.
Those are really great points, and I love the way you describe it as your story. And I think that really does sort of address, like, if you're one of 1,000, show your link to it. Do you have any specific things about how to address your background if it's in liberal arts? I mean, you're in a technical field too. I'm sure you face some of those issues.
Yes, right. So I have a degree in psychology and went into IT. So yes, I have. The thing is that certainly I'm in HR and IT, so it's relative. The thing about liberal arts is that, especially if you don't have a lot of work experience, and they may some more senior professionals may not admit this, but they know that what you study in school has a big impact in terms of the knowledge base, certainly. But the biggest thing that you learn in school, because many people go into fields that are not directly related, is you learn how to gain knowledge, you learn how to apply it, you learn how to work with people, you learn how to move forward, especially for students who go to challenging universities or challenging educational environments. That's the value. I don't think that in many fields employers really expect you to be able to do the job when you're straight out of school. But you can always choose aspects of what you've learned from an educational perspective and apply them to the role. I mean, you have to think through it, and understanding the role is really, really important. But I would always find a way to take some project you worked on, some team you were a part of, some real experiences that you have within the educational environment, and figure out how that applies to how you are going to be in a professional environment. Does that answer the question, Heather?
I think so. I think that does a good job of answering it. And I think it also addresses a little bit the next issue of, how do you then take that and make yourself special. It also makes me think a lot about the question the person asked about second, not just entry level. There seems that there's so much entry level. Just from my perspective, I run the Brown Alumni Job Board, and there are more entry level, but there are definitely jobs out there that say 3 to 5 years experience. I wonder too, from an HR perspective, I think because a lot of employers know that it's a larger pool that are new grads, if sometimes they don't advertise the job as entry level, because that just seems like an easy way to connect with it, to connect with employers, candidates.
I think you're right. There's a couple of things going on there. So one is, and this is just an honest challenge of right now. There are more in the recent job search history, time frame. There are more people with experience that are accepting more junior level jobs because that's what's available. So there has been some of that. The other thing is, quite honestly, from an HR perspective, we always know that whatever we say are those minimal year requirements, people with less than those requirements are going to apply to the job. So we definitely know that. Some jobs really do require that you have some experience, and that's difficult. But in terms of getting to those jobs, knowing what the prior experience is really important. Now, once in a while, people who are not quote unquote qualified for a job apply and really hit it out of the park in an interview. And if they're not accepted for that role, we might bring them in for another one. You want to make it a memorable, this is sort of back to the story, make it a memorable experience, because if it's not this role, it might be a different one, or, certainly we've interviewed people for one thing and realized they're not really the right fit for that one, but they made a great impression, or were very likable, seemed really sharp, and we thought, thought about that person down the road when something that was applicable did come up. So in terms of standing out, I think one of the questions had to do with standing out if you're 1,000. That is one of 1,000. Just sending your resume into a sort of an auto response thing is hard. I do suggest that if you're really interested in a position, that you try and speak to a person, even if the job posting doesn't say that that's what we're asking you to do. So, go to the website, find out who the recruiter is, find out, call the main number and find out who you might speak to, and show some diligence, because quite honestly, it's a hiring manager or it's a recruiter that's looking at all those resumes, and they're, taking, depending on the type of job, maybe hundreds or 1,000 of resumes and weeding them out in some way, based on criteria that they've predefined, and it is a very it's not a very individualized process to get them down. Now, usually what happens is they get them down to, some manageable number of resumes of people to reach out to, and then those reach out starts, which is why I say, again, being ready for that first conversation is really important, because making a great impression in that first call can get you an in-person interview. And then making a great impression in that in-person interview obviously takes you to the next steps.
Mm-hmm. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels much better for a company to have a referral from somebody inside or from somebody that they know that that it's a real person as opposed to a piece of paper. So use the networking resources, and if you're from Brown, there is some great resources. And if you're not on LinkedIn, get on LinkedIn and use the Brown. If you use any of the alumni pages, there's 50, 60,000 Brown alumni there. So search the companies or the industries and, see if there's someone you can connect with that way.
I definitely agree with that. So even if it's not your best friend who's worked at the company, but an acquaintance or someone if you can find an in and a connection and you can get that person to submit your resume to the hiring manager or recruiter, certainly that's great. But even if you're sort of already in the process of applying for a position, if you can find someone that that can help you sort of get connected with the right person, that's really, really helpful. We consider our referral, internally in my organization, and many organizations are like this, we have referral programs. Some of our best hires come from other people within the organization already who have referred someone, and they certainly go to the front of the line. Now that can be a challenge, though, if you haven't had a lot of professional experience, so you might have to work a little harder to get to that, as Heather, you're suggesting. You have to work your LinkedIn connections. Maybe you reach out to someone that you don't know and say, I see you work for this organization. I'm very interested in this position. What are your recommendations for how I might make sure my resume gets in front of that hiring manager? People can be very helpful in that way, that you even don't have very personal relationships with.
So one other thing that you mentioned earlier, and then we'll go on, was to demonstrate balance, show enthusiasm, and that you have goals and that you have patience. Are there any things that you would recommend to help reveal that in an interview?
Yes, I certainly think having examples of where you've taken initiative in the past are good. That's more about, hey, I'm really interested and I'm going to be enthusiastic. But talking about some things that you've done where you have had a long-term commitment, again, to a project or item, or something you did that was maybe not quote unquote the most interesting, but you learned something from. And is saying, hey, I did this work. I didn't know what I thought about it at first. It was very administrative, but here's what I learned, and here's how I think that's going to be important for the next thing that I do. That's the way to sort of be able to translate that information. In terms of the commitment piece, I think that I'm of the belief that people should address things pretty directly. I think it's okay to say, I know that you might think that I'm one of these people who's not going to be committed in long term. That's not my plan. My plan is to get into a role where I can really learn, make a contribution to an organization, and be committed to it for some period of time. Now, granted, that commitment, nobody's expecting anybody to be committing to a 10-year stint, right? But articulate that you plan to be committed to where you are when you're there, is my recommendation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So then the last thing I want to say, I think, about the interviewing is when you are in the interview or when you have, been given the opportunity, if you're asked about, if you've exhausted all your questions, great. If you haven't, been sort of given the opportunity to ask the questions, take that time at the end of the interview to raise any of them that you didn't get addressed. If you're asked to ask questions, or if you're asked if you have any questions, make sure you come up with at least one that hasn't already been there. And those can be about logistical items, like, what are the next steps? They can be, kind of what is the time frame type of questions without being too aggressive about it. And then if you're interested in the position, you should leave that interview, the person interviewing you or the people interviewing you should know that you're interested. There should be no question in their mind about whether you're interested in the role. Certainly you don't need to be, have decided that this is the place for you in that one meeting, but if you're interested, they should know it. And then I always do, and it may sound a little old school, I'll just say it, but I do believe that it makes a difference to send a thank you note following up an interview. You might go a little bit more in depth, referring to the things that you talked about in a place that you think you're really interested in, but I think a follow-up thank you is always important. Again, back to my point of before, you may have interviewed for a position and you may not get that one, but someone in the process might remember you. You might meet them down the road in a different situation, so you always want to leave everything on a really positive note.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great one. Thank you for mentioning that.
Okay, so let's move on now. You are getting the job. You have found a role. You've been, offered a position, and you're hired. Some things that we thought, are really interesting about understanding the relationship between you and your potential manager. So some tips for to making your new career a success. So if you look at this graph, which I thought was really interesting, some of the differences between millennials and non-millennials who manage them. Meaningful work, much more important for millennials. You guys knew that already. High pay, less important, but very important to the non-millennials. A sense of accomplishment is up there versus with the millennials, sorry. And then the high responsibility differences I thought were really astonishing. So the people who are potentially managing you, they want to be responsible for things, and the sense of accomplishment is less. And what I think this is very true in what we see. People want to do something that's meaningful. The pay, maybe they're willing to, if they have the ability to, they're willing to potentially not be so focused on the pay for the meaningful work and the sense of accomplishment, and the responsibility is less important. So it's interesting to just kind of have that in your mind as you're working with your future managers or your current managers. So in terms of getting on the path, a positive path in your career direction, we talked about this a little bit, but I just want to reinforce, have a willingness to embrace the fact that some administrative tasks are important to the organization, whether or not they are so exciting and interesting to you. Really learn why that is important. Understand how it fits into the bigger picture for the organization, and then that will give you more of a sense of accomplishment about the work that you're doing. Offer your opinion at the right time. So we see this often with people who are really engaged and really smart and sharp. There's a jump in to give your opinion, or a jump in to make an assessment and suggest change, perhaps. Really, before you're offering your opinion, certainly when you're asked your opinion, you should give it. But make sure you understand the history of what you're talking about as much as you can. Make sure you understand all the different things going on as much as you can, and offer your opinion at the right time. And be aware of the perceptions is part of that. Be aware that you might be stepping on somebody's toes when you make that suggestion. Do it in a way that's thoughtful, and do it in a way that's respectful of whatever the work that has already happened has been. And then, again, in terms of building your career, as you move along this road and you are making decisions about the future, or if you're in a position now that you're making some assessments about, should you enter a new field? Is this the wrong role for you? Some things to think about. So how do you know when to consider leaving? I'll call these three things really are a lot about energy. If you're not good at something, it's really hard to be positive about it. If you really have tried something, you've given it, you've been trained, you've been in the environment, you've tried to do it, and you just don't have, something isn't clicking, you're not good at it, that's a time to consider maybe this is not the right thing for you. If it sucks the life out of you, you're not looking forward to going into your role every day, to work every day, you're not looking forward to the kind of work you're doing, you're not energetic about it, it's very hard to continue that way, and that's a time that you might consider and doing something different. And if there's an impossible culture fit, you're very focused on social responsibility and the company is only focused on other things. If that feels like it's not something that fits right with you, even though you've had a position, then it's important to think about what to do next. Once you've had, I think here is an important thing. I want to be clear that, you have to have given it a reasonable sort of amount of time before you start making these assessments. And again, these three things, not being good at it, sucking the life out of you, and it being an impossible culture fit, are really about the energy. If you can't have positive energy about what you're doing, it's very difficult to do a great job and to be considered for the great things that you want to have moving forward. So assuming you want to be in a position to make a change, how do you get yourself there? Volunteering for projects in an area of interest. I'm going to talk a little bit now about timing, about what I think is sort of the minimal time commitment in being in a role. And what I say might be surprising, so I'm prepared for that. But so I say that when you take a new role, you should be prepared when you take it to make a commitment of 18 months. And I'll explain that 18-month time frame now. The first piece of it is the fact that most employees, especially if you have less experience in a position, will take 3 to 6 months to really be trained and fully ramp up into their position. And when I say ramp up, I mean to the point where the utilization or the person is really able to do their job at the rate at which the employer is looking at it. This is really from the employer perspective. So there's some training, kind of learning curve. There's some ramp up. And in 3 to 6 months, depending on the role, then the person is really fully in the role and they're really productive in that role, making that contribution to the organization that we talked about before, right? This is the synergy part of it. You've been trained to learn, you learned something, now you're doing it for the organization. The organization needs that. That's why they've hired you. In that 6 to 12 month area is where your side of it is that you have really learned now how to do it. And so you should get more efficient. You should be able to do it more quickly. And then you get the opportunity. Now is when you have the opportunity to potentially have more room in your day or more room in your work life to volunteer for other things. So you might have some time on your hands, or you might have some capability because you're not learning quite as much at that time potentially, to say to a teammate, to your manager, or or someone even in another group, I have some capability. Do you need any help here? I'm really interested in what you're doing. Once you've mastered the basics, you can offer to do something in draft. So, managers certainly appreciate it if somebody says, hey, I know this is something that you do that I'd like to try and take a stab at. Can I take a stab at it, and let's schedule some time to review my work, right? You have to be able to do your role. You have to be able to demonstrate that you've done it well. And this again goes back to what we said before about doing, showing excellent work even in things that you might be less enthusiastic about. Once you've demonstrated that you can do a great job, that's when people will give you the opportunities to try other things. So, this is a time where you can volunteer for projects in an area of interest and potentially get the opportunity to stretch and flex into the things that you want to do next. Professional organizations are also a great way to become knowledgeable about something when you don't have a lot of hands-on experience. So read articles, LinkedIn groups, organizations as well. They're all ways to become knowledgeable about something and then use that and apply that knowledge to areas that you might volunteer in People want to know that you're going to be helpful, or they like to see enthusiasm and helpfulness. So then back to the time frame. In the 6 to 12 months time frame, you have theoretically been able to demonstrate that you're doing a great job. Many companies don't really consider promoting someone out of their current role until they've seen that they've done a good job in what they've been trained in, gotten some positive benefit to the organization out of that, and then they're thinking, this person is doing a great job. What are the next things for them potentially within our organization? Theoretically, also, in that time frame around, by about a year, you should have had an opportunity, at least one formal opportunity to have a review or an evaluation or a discussion about where you are in terms of from your manager's or team's perspective, and where you want to be now that you learned about the organization. So that's why I say that the 18-month period, because you really have to give yourself time to establish yourself, be a contributor, be assessed, and have the discussion about, now that you know the organization, where you would like to go. And then the next thing we'll talk about is how to not burn bridges and continue the stereotypes. So this is also, we talked about the minimal time commitment. But if you decide that, you don't see the opportunities that you think that you were hoping for, or there's some other thing that's not working for you, and you decide to find another opportunity, it's really important to think about how you choose to do that. Always respect whatever the company policies are. Traditionally, it's about a 2-week resignation period if you choose to resign. In that time frame, you should always continue to do your best work. You should help in transition wherever it's needed. So if you're transitioning the work to someone else in the interim before they've replaced you, et cetera, do your best job at that. Leave it on a good note. If something was not going well, if it's a situation where the life was being sucked out of you and you've chosen to leave for that reason, you should always still leave on a high note. No company bashing or manager bashing or any of those types of things, because later on down the road, we talked about networking before. One of those people that you're working with, even though this wasn't the right role, might be someone who's your connection into another thing, or someone who's hiring for a position. So you always want to, show decorum and leave in a positive way. You'd be surprised how small the world can be, and often people sort of take this time to show something that they didn't show in the time before, and it turns out to hurt them in the long run.
I think that's a really good point, and I appreciate you taking the time, because I think it's easy to say, oh, I want to look for a job, and we're going through that, but it's also important to realize that you need that experience, and maybe you are having to step back and take entry level, even though you have 3 to 5 years of experience, to build those relationships and to build that time, even though it may be so frustrating, or maybe that's what's going on in the world of work today. I did want to share a story from that. We have a tool here called Brunette, which is for informational interviewing. There's LinkedIn. There's lots of postings and internships, and an alum who's been very helpful and gracious, and often answers questions to young alumni and students. And he was contacted by a young alum asking if he could do an externship, and this guy went to bat for him, got him a job, and then when the HR person contacted, he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I took another job." No, thank you, no follow-up. And this alum's going to remember who he is, and he, it took some work on our side to get him to come back and post more jobs and to, be part of the organization. So it does come back around. And what made me think about that too is someone asked a question following up about the thank you notes. Is an email appropriate? What's the best way? Do you send it to everyone you interviewed with? Just talk about the etiquette a little bit.
Sure. I think email certainly is appropriate. It doesn't have to be, a personal note. Although I have seen that happen, and it is a nice touch, I'll say. For something that you really, really want, I wouldn't say it's a bad idea. I think email is perfectly fine. It's quick. You can do it, within a reasonable time frame. I generally do say that you should send something to everyone you've interviewed with. They will, kind of reconvene and talk about you later. So, if one of them's received it and one of them has not, that may be an awkward situation. I think, as I said, I always recommend doing one. Thank you for your time. It was great to learn about the company. Please let me know if you have any questions. But if you can include in that email some specific things that is clear to the person reading it, it should not be like a template thing that you send to everyone, because that's really obvious, right? It was a pleasure to learn about the insert specific things you talked about at your organization. I look forward to the next steps, those types of things. It's much better. Even if you're not, if you leave the interview and you feel like, that's not the place for me, I wouldn't spend a lot of time, going to that effort, but I would send a few sentence thank you, telling the person that you appreciated their time and perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any other questions, Heather?
Yeah, there was a couple more that came through. What are some ways that you can show that you're a team player? What are ways that you can, show that you're going to be committed to the current organization and work for their goals?
Yeah, I think talking about, if you have them, certainly talking about examples of having done that in the past are great. And it doesn't have to be within a professional environment. Like, being a team player can come out of a lot of different areas. Showing an example where the thing you're working on, you were not the lead, it was not your thing, but you made a contribution, and showing how that contribution helped something be successful is a great way. If you don't have, it's hard for me to imagine there are not some examples like that, but if you don't have one, again, I think it's good to talk about what your plan is, right? Here's what I would like to do. I would like to become a part of a team. I would like to, spend the next year really learning about something. I enjoy working in a team environment, etc. And here's what I hope to see happen in my next role is a way to do it as well. But if you can come up with a concrete example of a way that you contributed in a group as part of a team, on a project that you were not the lead on, or doing something that was maybe not as glitz and glamour, but was important and you can recognize it, I think that achieves the goal.
Mm-hmm. I actually pulled this back up because I think it relates a little bit to what you're saying. It's just, also being aware of the culture and the people that you're interviewing with or negotiating with, because a question has come in about negotiating salaries. How do you go about negotiating salaries? I will give a plug that in the fall we did do a webinar on negotiation, specifically salary negotiation, but it would be great to get Brandie's take on this.
So negotiating salary is a tricky one, right?
Yeah.
I think you have to be knowledgeable about what the anticipated salary is for the role. It's actually a good point I didn't think to mention, but you may be asked this on your first interview, right? Ballpark, like what is it, the compensation that you're looking for? A question like that might come up. So you should have thought about that before you get there. I do think that if you are made an offer and it's not meeting your expectations, and you have a realistic view and not, you have some knowledge about what the going rate is, the time to ask or the time to have to do the negotiation is before you've accepted the job, right? No one, it's an awkward thing. I don't think that anyone really faults anybody for trying to do their best at this point, when they're accepting a role. You want it to be something that you want to, everybody wants to go into it on a positive note. We don't want you to accepting a position you're really unhappy with the salary with, and you don't want that either, because in 6 months you're going to be looking for something else, right? So I think that the part that's challenging is realistic expectations, especially if you're not in a current role. So a lot of what we do when we are sort of on the recruiting side looking at this information is we ask people what they're making now, right? And so that can if you don't have a lot of experience, or if you've been way off in your current salary, that can hurt you. So you have to think about, here's what I'm making now. You have to know kind of what the going rate is for what it is that you are trying to get into. And then you have to do a little bit of a gut check on what's the most important thing. Is the experience, back to the graphic that we're looking at now, is the sense of accomplishment and the meaningful work, what value does that have to you compared to what you're being offered?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have other things that you said in the seminar that that would be helpful for the audience to hear?
I think there was a couple of nice graphics and a couple of resources for researching researching salaries that they might want to look up, and it'll be on the alumni webinars, and it was done by Sarah Venance and Goldberg. So they might just want to do a quick push through that to get that information. And I'm sorry, I got a little distracted because there was a couple of other questions coming in, and they're all a little related to internships, but you and I had a conversation about, being offered constant internships even though you've been out a while, and someone's saying, what if I've been out and I want to get back to a different field and I want to take an internship, but I'm getting some pushback because I'm not a student. I think that that's all tricky, but because there's a lot of talk about the world of work and paid work and not paid work. I don't. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So on the internship, if you're not a student, organizations actually there are some requirements around that. So it's got to be a paid internship if you're not a student. So that might be some of the pushback from the work perspective.
Yeah, they could get in trouble if they hire you and they're not paying you. Exactly.
Right. So there is a technicality there. But in general, I think an internship, if you can do it, right, take an internship, and not everybody is in a position to be able to do that. If you can take an internship and it's going to, be beneficial to you to get you the experience that you need for the long-term goals, I think it makes sense. I do think that if you do internship after internship, you run the risk of what we said before, and you'll have to be able to explain why you made that choice, or that was the only thing available to you at the time, and you thought that it was better to do that than not be learning and moving forward, because it can look like a chronic internship situation, right? And I think if you can explain, listen, I was really trying to find a full-time role in a certain field, and it wasn't available, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to learn. And that's why I went through these, and I'm very much looking forward to the next steps and moving beyond the internship part of life. But an organization who's got some slated opportunities for internships for students will likely not do an unpaid internship for someone who's not a student for the reason I said initially.
I would also like to just give a shout out to this question that if you have some work experience, even if it's not back in the field, you can go, and look at maybe a more entry-level position, but don't sell yourself short. You have great experience now. You have great skills. Again, you just need to really look at how do I show connections between what I've been doing and what they're doing, and how can I show some examples of past experience of those skills. So you've given a lot of great information. I am going to laugh, Brandie, because I did just hear a big siren behind you.
I'm sorry.
That is the first one, though, so we've done a good job. You've given a lot of great information. I did ask you for some resources, and these were a couple that you had recommended. Can you talk about these for a second? Sure.
So Lean In, I know, is very popular, but it's also very pertinent to items that are related to how you approach your career. I mean, I think it's been, I'll caveat that it's been a little bit focused on sort of women within the workplace, but I think it's very important also for men in the workplace, any young professional, anybody who's going to, has someone in their life in the workforce, anybody who might manage someone later on. Really different interesting ideas about how the dynamics that go on within the workplace, some of the cultural implications, and some of the things that happen to be aware of as you are embarking upon your career or at different stages in your career. The other one is humanworkplace.com, and this is a person called Liz Ryan, and you can follow her on LinkedIn as well. But she has this sort of this set of materials and does articles about reinventing work for people, a lot about job search and the whole person. She has a lot of, sort of off the beaten path ideas about, how to go into an interview, how to do, address some of the questions that you guys had, negotiate your salary. She is actually very much, outspoken about the perceptions of non-millennials, of millennials, and focusing on the positive aspects of that. the stereotypical traits that are associated with millennials. So I think a lot of interesting reads here, a lot of advice about career searches at different stages, et cetera, that I wanted to share.
Great, thank you. Well, just in terms of resources, we are coming to the end, but I do want to let people know that through the Brown Alumni Careers, we do have a lot of education articles, connections out there that we try and give you. This is our website. Some of the services that we offer include resources for networking. There's Brunette. There's ways to get informational interviews. There's connections to understanding how to use LinkedIn, and just general ideas about that and ways to connect you with clubs or things to just help you better connect with the Brown community and the world of work. There are some job hunting tips and tools. We have obviously the webinar series, but in addition to that, we have a coaching referral program if you really need to take a deeper dive into your career development or how to get to the next step, and overall development areas. If you want to do some more assessment, think about where you are. Two of those new programs that I wanted to highlight is we have this Alumni Career Spotlight Series, and it's a great way of learning about different careers and what were some of the steps that people took. And also, as we talk about interviewing and all these difficulties, we have an interviewing tool. It's a mock interviewing. So you choose questions that you're having trouble with. You practice them. It tapes you. You can listen to it. You can count the number of ums that you do. Mine's always pretty high. And use that to help you along the path. Brandie has given us a lot of great information. She has kindly given her time back to Brown, and I really appreciate that. If you want to get in touch with her, you're interested in MindShift, there's her information. If you have more questions for me or the career programs, please feel free to contact us. And just to let you know, this year we're offering one more. And we're going to talk with Karen Alcott. She's calling it Leaning into Innovation, talking about how she's had a couple of really interesting, exciting career moves along the way. And basically she's, always looked for, what's new, what's exciting, what's going on out there. She's worked and founded some nonprofits. She's been in the, high tech. She worked for Microsoft. So I think that'll be a fun, interesting conversation, and I hope that you will get a chance to join us. So Brandie, thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we sign off?
No, just thank you, everyone, and good luck in your searches.
All right. Thanks for joining us today. Goodbye.